Book 7, Chapter 1. Gaul being tranquil, Kaiser, as he had determined, sets out for Italy to hold the provincial assizes. There he receives intelligence of the death of Clodius, and, being informed of the decree of the Senate, to the effect that all the youth of Italy should take the military oath, he determined to hold a levy throughout the entire province. Report of these events is rapidly borne into Transalpine Gaul. The Gauls themselves add to the report and invent what the case seemed to require, namely that Kaiser was detained by commotions in the city, and could not, amidst so violent dissensions, come to his army. Animated by this opportunity, they who already, previously to this occurrence, were indignant that they were reduced beneath the dominion of Rome, began to organize their plans for war more openly and daringly. The leading men of Gaul, having convened councils among themselves in the woods and retired places, complain of the death of Acco. They point out that this fate may fall in turn on themselves. They bewail the unhappy fate of Gaul, and by every sort of promises and rewards they earnestly solicit some to begin the war, and assert the freedom of Gaul at the hazard of their lives. They say that special care should be paid to this, that Kaiser should be cut off from his army before their secret plans should be divulged. That this was easy, because neither would the legions, in the absence of their general, dare to leave their winter quarters, nor could the general reach his army without a guard. Finally, that it was better to be slain in battle than not to recover their ancient glory in war, and that freedom which they had received from their forefathers. Chapter 2. Whilst these things are in agitation, the Carnutes declare that they would decline no danger for the sake of the general safety, and promise that they would be the first of all to begin the war. And, since they cannot at present take precautions, by giving and receiving hostages, that the affair shall not be divulged, they require that a solemn assurance be given them by oath and plighted honor, their military standards being brought together, in which manner their most sacred obligations are made binding, that they should not be deserted by the rest of the Gauls on commencing the war. Chapter 3. When the appointed day came, the Carnutes, under the command of Cotuatus and Conetodonos, desperate men, meet together at Cenabum, and slay the Roman citizens who had settled there for the purpose of trading. Among the rest, Gaius Fusius Quita, a distinguished Roman knight, who by Kaiser's orders had presided over the provision department, and plunder their property. The report is quickly spread among all the states of Gaul, for whenever a more important and remarkable event takes place, they transmit the intelligence through their lands and districts by a shout. The others take it up in succession and pass it to their neighbors, as happened on this occasion. For the things which were done at Cenabum at sunrise were heard in the territories of the Arverni before the end of the first watch, which is an extent of more than 160 miles. Chapter 4. There, in like manner, Vercingetorix, the son of Celtulus the Arvernian, a young man of the highest power, whose father had held the supremacy of entire Gaul, and had been put to death by his fellow citizens for this reason, because he aimed at sovereign power, summoned together his dependents, and easily excited them. On his design being made known, they rush to arms. He is expelled from the town of Gergovia by his uncle Gobanitio, and the rest of the nobles, who were of opinion that such an enterprise ought not to be hazarded. He did not, however, desist, but held in the country a levy of the needy and desperate. Having collected such a body of troops, he brings over to his sentiments such of his fellow citizens as he has access to. He exhorts them to take up arms in behalf of the general freedom, and, having assembled great forces, he drives from the state his opponents, by whom he had been expelled a short time previously. He is saluted king by his partisans. He sends ambassadors in every direction. He conjures them to adhere firmly to their promise. He quickly attaches to his interests the Senones, Parisii, Pictones, Cadurci, Turones, Aulerci, Lemovice, and all of the others who border on the ocean. The supreme command is conferred on him by unanimous consent. On obtaining this authority, he demands hostages from all these states. He orders a fixed number of soldiers to be sent to him immediately. He determines what quantity of arms each state shall prepare at home, and before what time. And he pays particular attention to the cavalry. To the utmost vigilance he adds the utmost rigor of authority, and by the severity of his punishments brings over the wavering. For on the commission of a greater crime he puts the perpetrators to death by fire and every sort of tortures. For a slighter cause, he sends home the offenders with their ears cut off, or one of their eyes put out, that they may be an example to the rest, and frighten others by the severity of their punishment. Chapter 5. Having quickly collected an army by their punishments, he sends Lucterius, one of the Caderci, a man of the utmost daring, with part of his forces into the territory of the Britanni, and marches in person into the country of the Bituriges. On his arrival, the Bituriges send ambassadors to the Idui, under whose protection they were, to solicit aid in order that they might more easily resist the forces of the enemy. The Igui, by the advice of the lieutenants whom Kaiser had left with the army, sent supplies of horse and foot to succor the Bituriges. When they came to the river Loire, which separates the Bituriges from the Igui, they delayed a few days there, and, not daring to pass the river, return home, and send back word to the lieutenants that they had returned through fear of the treachery of the Bituriges, who, they ascertained, had formed this design: that, if the Idui should cross the river, the Bituriges on one side and the Arverni on the other should surround them. Whether they did this for the reason which they alleged to the lieutenants, or influenced by treachery, we think that we ought not to state as certain, because we have no proof. On their departure, the Bituriges immediately unite themselves to the Arverni. Chapter 6. These affairs being announced to Kaiser in Italy at the time when he understood that matters in the city had been reduced to a more tranquil state by the energy of Gnaeus Pompey, he set out for Transalpine Gaul. After he had arrived there, he was greatly at a loss to know by what means he should reach his army, for if he should summon the legions into the province, he was aware that on their march they would have to fight in his absence. He foresaw, too, that if he himself should endeavor to reach the army, he would act injudiciously in trusting his safety even to those who seemed to be tranquilized. Chapter 7. In the meantime, Lucterius the Cadercan, having been sent into the country of the Britanni, gains over that state to the Arverni. Having advanced into the country of the Nitiobriges and Gabali, he receives hostages from both nations, and, assembling a numerous force, marches to make a descent on the province in the direction of Narbo. Kaiser, when this circumstance was announced to him, thought that the march to Narbo ought to take the precedence of all his other plans. When he arrived there, he encourages the timid, and stations garrisons among the Britanni, in the province of the Volcae Aricomici, and the country around Narbo which was in the vicinity of the enemy. He orders a portion of the forces from the province, and the recruits which he had brought from Italy, to rendezvous among the Helvii, who border on the territories of the Arverni. Chapter 8. These matters being arranged, and Lucterius now checked and forced to retreat, because he thought it dangerous to enter the line of Roman garrisons, Kaiser marches into the country of the Helvii. Although Mount Cevennes, which separates the Arverni from the Helvii, blocked up the way with very deep snow, as it was the severest season of the year, yet having cleared away the snow to the depth of 6 feet, and having opened the roads, he reaches the territories of the Arverni, with infinite labor to his soldiers. This people being surprised, because they considered themselves defended by the Cevennes as by a wall, and the paths at this season of the year had never before been passable even to individuals, he orders the cavalry to extend themselves as far as they could, and strike as great a panic as possible into the enemy. These proceedings are speedily announced to Vercingetorix by rumor and by his messengers. Around him all the Arverni crowd in alarm, and solemnly entreat him to protect their property, and not to suffer them to be plundered by the enemy, especially as he saw that all the war was transferred into their country. Being prevailed upon by their entreaties, he moves his camp from the country of the Bituriges in the direction of the Arverni. Chapter 9. Kaiser, having delayed 2 days in that place, because he had anticipated that in the natural course of events such would be the conduct of Vercingetorix, leaves the army under pretense of raising recruits and cavalry. He places Brutus, a young man, in command of these forces. He gives him instructions that the cavalry should range as extensively as possible in all directions, that he would exert himself not to be absent from the camp longer than 3 days. Having arranged these matters, he marches to Vienna by as long journeys as he can, when his own soldiers did not expect him. Finding there a fresh body of cavalry which he had sent on to that place several days before, marching incessantly day and night, he advanced rapidly through the territory of the Ideus into that of the Lingones, in which 2 legions were wintering, that if any plan affecting his own safety should have been organized by the Ideus, he might defeat it by the rapidity of his movements. When he arrived there, he sends information to the rest of the legions, and gathers all his army into one place before intelligence of his arrival could be announced to the Arverni. Vercingetorix, on hearing this circumstance, leads back his army into the country of the Bituriges, and after marching from it to Gergovia, a town of the Boii, whom Kaiser had settled there after defeating them in the Helvetian War, and had rendered tributary to the Igui, he determined to attack it. Chapter 10. This action caused great perplexity to Kaiser in the selection of his plans. He feared lest if he should confine his legions in one place for the remaining portion of the winter, all Gaul should revolt when the tributaries of the Igui were subdued, because it would appear that there was in him no protection for his friends. But if he should draw them too soon out of their winter quarters, he might be distressed by the want of provisions, in consequence of the difficulty of conveyance. It seemed better, however, to endure every hardship than to alienate the affections of all his allies, by submitting to such an insult. Having therefore impressed on the Igui the necessity of supplying him with provisions, he sends forward messengers to the Boii to inform them of his arrival, and encourage them to remain firm in their allegiance, and resist the attack of the enemy with great resolution. Having left 2 legions and the luggage of the entire army at Agendicum, he marches to the Boii. Chapter 11. On the 2nd day, when he came to Vellanodunum, a town of the Senones, he determined to attack it in order that he might not leave an enemy in his rear, and might the more easily procure supplies of provisions, and drew a line of circumvallation around it in 2 days. On the 3rd day, ambassadors being sent from the town to treat of a capitulation, he orders their arms to be brought together, their cattle to be brought forth, and 600 hostages to be given. He leaves Caius Trebonius, his lieutenant, to complete these arrangements. He himself sets out with the intention of marching as soon as possible to Cenabum, a town of the Carnutes, who, having then for the first time received information of the siege of Vellanodunum, as they thought that it would be protracted to a longer time, were preparing a garrison to send to Cenabum for the defense of that town. Kaiser arrived here in 2 days. After pitching his camp before the town, being prevented by the time of day, he defers the attack to the next day, and orders his soldiers to prepare whatever was necessary for that enterprise. And, as a bridge over the Loire connected the town of Cenabum with the opposite bank, fearing lest the inhabitants should escape by night from the town, he orders 2 legions to keep watch under arms. The people of Cenabum came forth silently from the city before midnight, and began to cross the river. When this circumstance was announced by the scouts, Kaiser, having set fire to the gates, sends in the legions which he had ordered to be ready, and obtains possession of the town so completely that very few of the whole number of the enemy escaped being taken alive, because the narrowness of the bridge and the roads prevented the multitude from escaping. He pillages and burns the town, and gives the booty to the soldiers, then leads his army over the Loire and marches into the territories of the Bituriges. Chapter 12. Vercingetorix, when he ascertained the arrival of Kaiser, desisted from the siege of Gergovia and marched to meet Kaiser. The latter had commenced to besiege Noviodunum, and when ambassadors came from this town to beg that he would pardon them and spare their lives, in order that he might execute the rest of his designs with the rapidity by which he had accomplished most of them, he orders their arms to be collected, their horses to be brought forth, and hostages to be given. A part of the hostages being now delivered up, when the rest of the terms were being performed, a few centurions and soldiers being sent into the town to collect the arms and horses, the enemy's cavalry, which had outstripped the main body of Vercingetorix's army, was seen at a distance. As soon as the townmen beheld them, and entertained hopes of assistance, raising a shout, they began to take up arms, shut the gates, and line the walls. When the centurions in the town understood from the signal-making of the Gauls that they were forming some new design, they drew their swords and seized the gates, and recovered all their men safe. Chapter 13. Kaiser orders the horse to be drawn out of the camp and commences a cavalry action. His men being now distressed, Kaiser sends to their aid about 400 German horse, which he had determined at the beginning to keep with himself. The Gauls could not withstand their attack, but were put to flight, and retreated to their main body, after losing a great number of men. When they were routed, the townsmen, again intimidated, arrested those persons by whose exertions they felt that the mob had been roused, and brought them to Kaiser, and surrendered themselves to him. When these affairs were accomplished, Kaiser marched to Avaricum, which was the largest and best fortified town in the territories of the Bituriges, and situated in a most fertile tract of country, because he confidently expected that on taking that town, he would reduce beneath his dominion the state of the Bituriges. Chapter 14. Vercingetorix, after sustaining such a series of losses at Velonodonum, Cenabum, and Noviodunum, summons his men to a council. He impresses on them that the war must be prosecuted on a very different system from that which they had been previously adopted. But they should by all means aim at this object, that the Romans should be prevented from foraging and procuring provisions. That this was easy, because they themselves were well supplied with cavalry and were likewise assisted by the season of the year. That forage could not be cut, that the enemy must necessarily disperse and look for it in the houses, that all these might be daily destroyed by the horse. Besides, that the interests of private property must be neglected for the sake of general safety, that the villages and houses ought to be fired over such an extent of country in every direction from Boii as the Romans appeared capable of scouring in their search for forage, that an abundance of these necessities could be supplied to them, because they would be assisted by the resources of those in whose territories the war would be waged, that the Romans either would not bear the privation, or else would advance to any distance from the camp with considerable danger, and that made it no difference whether they slew them or stripped them of their baggage, since, if it was lost, they could not carry on the war. Besides that, the towns ought to be burnt which were not secured against every danger by their fortifications or natural advantages, that there should not be places of retreat for their own countrymen for declining military service, nor be exposed to the Romans as inducements to carry off abundance of provisions and plunder. If these sacrifices should appear heavy or galling, that they ought to consider it much more distressing that their wives and children should be dragged off to slavery, and themselves slain, the evils which must necessarily befall the conquered. Chapter 15. This opinion having been approved of by unanimous consent, more than 20 towns of the Bituriges are burnt in one day. Conflagrations are beheld in every quarter, and although all bore this with great regret, yet they laid before themselves this consolation, that, as the victory was certain, they could quickly recover their losses. There is a debate concerning Avaricum in the General Council, whether they should decide that it should be burnt or defended. The Bituriges threw themselves at the feet of all the Gauls, and entreat that they should not be compelled to set fire with their own hands to the fairest city of almost the whole of Gaul, which was both a protection and ornament to the state. They say that they could easily defend it, owing to the nature of the ground, for, being enclosed on almost every side by a river and a marsh, it had only one entrance, and that very narrow. Permission being granted to them at their earnest request, Vercingetorix at first dissuades them from it, but afterwards concedes the point, owing to their entreaties and the compassion of the soldiers. A proper garrison is selected for the town. Chapter 16. Vercingetorix follows closely upon Kaiser by shorter marches, and selects for his camp a place defended by woods and marshes, at the distance of 15 miles from Avaricum. There he received intelligence by trusty scouts every hour in the day of what was going on at Avaricum, and ordered whatever he wished to be done. He closely watched all our expeditions for corn and forage, and whenever they were compelled to go a greater distance, he attacked them when dispersed, and inflicted severe loss upon them, although the evil was remedied by our men, as far as precautions could be taken, by going forth at irregular times and by different ways. Chapter 17. Kaiser, pitching his camp at that side of the town which was not defended by the river and marsh, and had a very narrow approach, as we have mentioned, began to raise the Vinii and erect 2 towers, for the nature of the place prevented him from drawing a line of circumvallation. He never ceased to importune the Boii and Idui for supplies of corn, of whom the one, the Idui, because they were acting with no zeal, did not aid him much. The others, the Boii, as their resources were not great, quickly consumed what they had. Although the army was distressed by the greatest want of corn, through the poverty of the Boii, the apathy of the Idui, and the burning of the houses, to such a degree that for several days the soldiers were without corn, and satisfied their extreme hunger with cattle driven from the remote villages, yet no language was heard from them unworthy of the majesty of the Roman people and their former victories. Moreover, when Kaiser addressed the legions one by one when at work, and said that he would raise the siege if they felt the scarcity too severely, they unanimously begged him not to do so, that they had served for several years under his command in such a manner that they never submitted to insult, and never abandoned an enterprise without accomplishing it. That they should consider it a disgrace if they abandoned the siege after commencing it. That it was better to endure every hardship than not to avenge the names of the Roman citizens who perished at Cenabum by the perfidy of the Gauls. They trusted the same declarations to the centurions and military tribunes, that through them they might be communicated to Kaiser. Chapter 18. When the towers had now approached the walls, Kaiser ascertained from the captives that Vercingetorix, after destroying the forage, had pitched his camp nearer Avaricum, and that he himself with the cavalry and light-armed infantry, who generally fought among the horse, had gone to lay an ambuscade in that quarter, to which he thought that our troops would come the next day to forage. On learning these facts, he set out from the camp secretly at midnight, and reached the camp of the enemy early in the morning. They, having quickly learned the arrival of Kaiser by scouts, hid their cars and baggage in the thickest parts of the woods, and drew up all their forces in a lofty and open space. Which circumstance being announced, Kaiser immediately ordered the baggage to be piled, and the arms to be got ready. Chapter 19. There was a hill of a gentle ascent from the bottom, a dangerous and impassable marsh, not more than 50 feet broad, begirted on almost every side. The Gauls, having broken down the bridges, posted themselves on this hill, in confidence of their position, and, being drawn up in tribes according to their respective states, held all the fords and passages of that marsh with trusty guards. Thus determined that if the Romans should attempt to force the march, they would overpower them from the higher ground while sticking in it, so that whoever saw the nearness of the position would imagine that the two armies were prepared to fight on almost equal terms. But whoever should view accurately the disadvantage of the position would discover that they were showing off an empty affectation of courage. Kaiser clearly points out to his soldiers, who were indignant that the enemy could bear the sight of them at the distance of so short a space, and were earnestly demanding the signal for action, with how great loss and the death of how many gallant men the victory would necessarily be purchased. And, when he saw them so determined to decline no danger for his renown, that he ought to be considered guilty of the utmost injustice if he did not hold their life dearer than his own personal safety. Having thus consoled his soldiers, he leads them back on the same day to the camp, and determined to prepare the other things which were necessary for the siege of the town. Chapter 20. Vercingetorix, when he had returned to his men, was accused of treason, in that he had moved his camp nearer the Romans, in that he had gone away with all the cavalry, in that he had left so great forces without a commander, in that, on his departure, the Romans had come at such a favorable season, and with such dispatch, that all these circumstances could not have happened accidentally or without design, that he preferred holding the sovereignty of Gaul by the grant of Kaiser, to acquiring it by their favor. Being accused in such a manner, he made the following reply to these charges: that his moving his camp had been caused by want of forage, and had been done even by their advice; that his approaching near the Romans had been a measure dictated by the favorable nature of the ground, which would defend him by its natural strength; that the service of the cavalry could not have been requisite in marshy ground, and was useful in that place to which they had gone; that he, on his departure, had given the supreme command to no one intentionally, lest he should be induced by the eagerness of the multitude to hazard an engagement, to which he perceived that all were inclined, owing to their want of energy, because they were unable to endure fatigue any longer; that, if the Romans in the meantime came up by chance, they, the Gauls, should feel grateful to fortune; if invited by the information of some one they should feel grateful to him, because they were enabled to see distinctly from the higher ground the smallness of the number of their enemy, and despised the courage of those who, not daring to fight, retreated disgracefully into their camp. That he desired no power from Kaiser by treachery, since he would have it by victory, which was now assured to himself and to all the Gauls. Nay, that he would even give them back the command if they thought that they conferred honor on him, rather than received safety from him. That you may be assured, said he, that I speak these words from truth. Listen to these Roman soldiers. He produces some camp followers, whom he had surprised on a foraging expedition some days before, and had tortured by famine and confinement. They, being previously instructed in what answers they should make when examined, say that they were legionary soldiers, that, urged by famine and want, they had recently gone forth from the camp to see if they could find any corn or cattle in the fields. That the whole army was distressed by a similar scarcity, nor had any one now sufficient strength, nor could bear the labor of the work, and therefore that the general was determined, if he made no progress in the siege, to draw off his army in 3 days. These benefits, said Vercingetorix, you receive from me, whom you accuse of treason. Me, by whose exertions you see so powerful and victorious an army almost destroyed by famine, without shedding one drop of your blood. And I have taken precautions that no state shall admit within its territories this army in its ignominious flight from this place. Chapter 21. The whole multitude raise a shout and clash their arms, according to their custom, as they usually do in the case of him whose speech they approve. They exclaim that Vercingetorix was a consummate general, and that they had no doubt of his honor, that the war could not be conducted with greater prudence. They determine that 10,000 men should be picked out of the entire army and sent into the town, and decide that the general safety should not be entrusted to the Bituriges alone, because they were aware that the glory of the victory must rest with the Bituriges, if they made good the defense of the town. Chapter 22. To the extraordinary valor of our soldiers, devices of every sort were opposed by the Gauls, since they are a nation of consummate ingenuity, and most skillful in imitating and making those things which are imparted by any one, for they turned aside the hooks with nooses, and when they had caught hold of them firmly, drew them on by means of engines, and undermined the mound the more skillfully on this account, because there are in their territories extensive iron mines, and consequently every description of mining operations is known and practiced by them. They had furnished, moreover, the whole wall on every side with turrets, and had covered them with skins. Besides, in their frequent sallies by day and night, they attempted either to set fire to the mound or attack our soldiers when engaged in the works. And, moreover, by splicing the upright timbers of their own towers, they equalled the height of ours, as fast as the mound had daily raised them, and countermined our mines, and impeded the working of them by stakes bent and sharpened at the ends, and boiling pitch, and stones of very great weight, and prevented them from approaching the walls. Chapter 23. But this is usually the form of all the Gallic walls. Straight beams, connected lengthwise and 2 feet distant from each other at equal intervals, are placed together in the ground. These are mortised on the inside and covered with plenty of earth. But the intervals we have mentioned are closed up in front by large stones. These being thus laid and cemented together, another row is added above, in such a manner that the same interval may be observed, and that the beams may not touch one another, but equal spaces intervening, each row of beams is kept firmly in its place by a row of stones. In this manner the whole wall is consolidated, until the regular height of the wall be completed. This work, with respect to appearance and variety, is not unsightly, owing to the alternate rows of beams and stones, which preserve their order in right lines. And besides, it possesses great advantages as regards utility in the defense of cities, for the stone protects it from fire, and the wood from the battering ram, since it, the wood, being mortised in the inside with rows of beams, generally 40 feet each in length, can neither be broken through nor torn asunder. Chapter 24. The siege having been impeded by so many disadvantages, the soldiers, although they were retarded during the whole time by the mud, cold, and constant showers, yet by their incessant labor overcame all these obstacles, and in 25 days raised a mound 330 feet broad and 80 feet high. When it almost touched the enemy's walls, and Kaiser, according to his usual custom, kept watch at the work, and encouraged the soldiers not to discontinue the work for a moment, a little before the third watch they discovered that the mound was sinking, since the enemy had set it on fire by a mine, and at the same time a shout was raised along the entire wall, and a sally was made from 2 gates on each side of the turrets. Some at a distance were casting torches and dry wood from the wall on the mound. Others were pouring on it pitch and other materials by which the flame might be excited, so that a plan could hardly be formed as to where they should first run to the defense, or to what part aid should be brought. However, as 2 legions always kept guard before the camp by Kaiser's orders, and several of them were at stated times at the work, measures were promptly taken that some should oppose the sallying party, others draw back the towers and make a cut in the rampart, and moreover, that the whole army should hasten from the camp to extinguish the flames. Chapter 25. When the battle was going on in every direction, the rest of the night being now spent and fresh hopes of victory always rose before the enemy, the more so on this account because they saw the coverings of our towers burnt away, and perceived that we, being exposed, could not easily go to give assistance, and they themselves were always relieving the weary with fresh men, and considered that all the safety of Gaul rested on this crisis. There happened, in my own view, a circumstance which, having appeared to be worthy of record, we thought it ought not to be omitted. A certain Gaul before the gate of the town, who was casting into the fire opposite the turret balls of tallow and fire which were passed along to him, was pierced with a dart on the right side and fell dead. One of those next him stepped over him as he lay, and discharged the same office. When the second man was slain in the same manner by a wound from a crossbow, a third succeeded him, and a fourth succeeded the third. Nor was this post left vacant by the besieged, until, the fire of the mound having been extinguished, and the enemy repulsed in every direction, an end was put to the fighting. Chapter 25. The Gauls, having tried every expedient, as nothing had succeeded, adopted the design of fleeing from the town the next day, by the advice and order of Vercingetorix. They hoped that by attempting it at the dead of night, they could effect it without any great loss of men, because the camp of Vercingetorix was not far distant from the town, and the extensive marsh which intervened was likely to retard the Romans in the pursuit. And they were now preparing to execute this by night, when the matrons suddenly ran out into the streets, and weeping, cast themselves at the feet of their husbands, and requested of them with every entreaty that they should not abandon themselves and their common children to the enemy for punishment, because the weakness of their nature and physical powers prevented them from taking flight. When they saw that they, as fear does not generally admit of mercy in extreme danger, persisted in their resolution, they began to shout aloud and give intelligence of their flight to the Romans. The Gauls, being intimidated by fear of this, lest the passes should be preoccupied by the Roman cavalry, desisted from their design. Chapter 27. The next day Kaiser, the tower being advanced, and the works which he had determined to raise being arranged, a violent storm arising, thought this no bad time for executing his designs, because he observed the guards arranged on the walls a little too negligently, and therefore ordered his own men to engage in their work more remissly, and pointed out what he wished to be done. He drew up his soldiers in a secret position within the Vinii, and exhorts them to reap, at last, the harvest of victory proportionate to their exertions. He proposed a reward for those who should first scale the walls, and gave the signal to the soldiers. They suddenly flew out from all quarters, and quickly filled the wall. Chapter 28. The enemy, being alarmed by the suddenness of the attack, were dislodged from the wall and towers, and drew up in form of a wedge in the marketplace and the open streets, with this intention, that if an attack should be made on any side, they should fight with their line drawn up to receive it. When they saw no one descending to the level ground, and the enemy extending themselves along the entire wall in every direction, fearing lest every hope of flight should be cut off, they cast away their arms, and sought, without stopping, the most remote parts of the town. A part was then slain by the infantry when they were crowding upon one another in the narrow passage of the gates, and a part, having got without the gates, were cut to pieces by the cavalry, nor was there anyone who was anxious for the plunder. Thus, being excited by the massacre at Cenabum and the fatigue of the siege, they spared neither those worn out with years, women, or children. Finally, out of all that number, which amounted to about 40,000, scarcely 800, who fled from the town when they heard the first alarm, reached Vercingetorix in safety. And he, the night being now far spent, received them in silence after their flight, fearing that any sedition should arise in the camp from their entrance in a body and the compassion of the soldiers. So that, having arranged his friends and the chiefs of the states at a distance on the road, he took precautions that they should be separated and conducted to their fellow countrymen, to whatever part of the camp had been assigned to each state from the beginning. Chapter 29. Vercingetorix, having convened an assembly on the following day, consoled and encouraged his soldiers in the following words: that they should not be too much depressed in spirit, nor alarmed at their loss; that the Romans did not conquer by valor, nor in the field, but by a kind of art and skill in assault, with which they themselves were unacquainted; that whoever expected every event in the war to be favorable erred; that it never was his opinion that Avaricum should be defended, of the truth of which statement he had themselves as witnesses, but that it was owing to the imprudence of the Bituriges, and the too ready compliance of the rest, that this loss was sustained; that, however, he would soon compensate it by superior advantages, for that he would, by his exertions, bring over those states which severed themselves from the rest of the Gauls, and would create a general unanimity throughout the whole of Gaul, the union of which not even the whole earth could withstand, and that he had it already almost effected; that in the meantime it was reasonable that he should prevail on them, for the sake of the general safety, to begin to fortify their camp, in order that they might the more easily sustain the sudden attacks of the enemy. Chapter 30. This speech was not disagreeable to the Gauls, principally because he himself was not disheartened by receiving so severe a loss, and had not concealed himself, nor shunned the eyes of the people, and he was believed to possess a greater foresight and sounder judgment than the rest, because when the affair was undecided, he had at first been of the opinion that Avaricum should be burnt, and afterwards that it should be abandoned. Accordingly, as ill success weakens the authority of other generals, so, on the contrary, his dignity increased daily, although a loss was sustained. At the same time, they began to entertain hopes, on his assertion, of uniting the rest of the states to themselves. And on this occasion, for the first time, the Gauls began to fortify their camps, and were so alarmed that although they were men unaccustomed to toil, yet they were of opinion that they ought to endure and suffer everything which should be imposed upon them. Chapter 31. Nor did Vercingetorix use less efforts than he had promised to gain over the other states, and in consequence endeavored to entice their leaders by gifts and promises. For this object he selected fitting emissaries by whose subtle pleading or private friendship each of the nobles could be most easily influenced. He takes care that those who fled to him on the storming of Avaricum should be provided with arms and clothes. At the same time that his diminished forces should be recruited, he levies a fixed quota of soldiers from each state, and defines the number and day before which he should wish them brought to the camp, and orders all the archers, of whom there was a very great number in Gaul, to be collected and sent to him. By these means the troops which were lost at Avaricum are speedily replaced. In the meantime, Teutomarus, the son of Olovicon, the king of the Bituriges, whose father had received the appellation of friend from our Senate, came to him with a great number of his own horse, and those whom he had hired from Aquitania. Chapter 32. Kaiser, after delaying several days at Avaricum, and finding there the greatest plenty of corn and other provisions, refreshed his army after their fatigue and privation. The winter being almost ended, when he was invited by the favorable season of the year to prosecute the war and march against the enemy, and try whether he could draw them from the marshes and woods, or else press them by a blockade, some noblemen of the Igui came to him as ambassadors to entreat that in an extreme emergency he should succor their state, that their affairs were in the utmost danger, because whereas single magistrates had been usually appointed in ancient times, and held the power of king for a single year, 2 persons now exercised this office, and each asserted that he was appointed according to their laws. that one of them was Convictolitanis, a powerful and illustrious youth, the other Cotus, sprung from a most ancient family, and personally a man of very great influence and extensive connections. His brother Waletiacus had borne the same office during the last year, that the whole state was up in arms, the Senate divided, the people divided, that each of them had his own adherents, and that if the animosity would be fomented any longer, the result would be that one part of the state would come to a collision with the other, that it rested with his activity and influence to prevent it. Chapter 32. Although Kaiser considered it ruinous to leave the war in the enemy, yet being well aware what great evils generally arise from internal dissensions, lest a state so powerful and so closely connected with the Roman people, which he himself had always fostered and honored in every respect, should have recourse to violence and arms, and that the party which had less confidence in its own power should summon aid from Vercingetorix, he determined to anticipate this movement. And, because by the laws of the Ideus it was not permitted those who held the supreme authority to leave the country, he determined to go in person to the Ideus, lest he should appear to infringe upon their government and laws, and summoned all the Senate and those between whom the dispute was to meet him at Dicitia. When almost all the state had assembled there, and he was informed that one brother had been declared magistrate by the other, when only a few persons were privately summoned for the purpose, at a different time and place from what he ought, whereas the laws not only forbade two belonging to one family to be elected magistrates while each was alive, but even deterred them from being in the Senate, he compelled Cotus to resign his office. He ordered Convictolitanis, who had been elected by the priests, according to the usage of the state, in the presence of the magistrates, to hold the supreme authority. Chapter 34. Having pronounced this decree between the contending parties, he exhorted the Ideus to bury in oblivion their disputes and dissensions, and, laying aside all these things, devote themselves to the war, and expect from him, on the conquest of Gaul, those rewards which they should have earned, and sent speedily to him all their cavalry and 10,000 infantry, which he might place in different garrisons to protect his convoys of provisions, and then divided his army into two parts. He gave Labienus 4 legions to lead into the country of the Senones and Parisi, and led in person 6 into the country of the Arverni, in the direction of the town of Gergovia, along the banks of the Allier. He gave part of the cavalry to Labienus, and kept part to himself. Vercingetorix, on learning this circumstance, broke down all the bridges over the river and began to march on the other bank of the Allier. Chapter 35. When each army was in sight of the other, and was pitching their camp almost opposite that of the enemy, scouts being distributed in every quarter, lest the Romans should build a bridge and bring over their troops, it was to Kaiser a matter attended with great difficulties, lest he should be hindered from passing the river during the greater part of the summer, as the Allier cannot generally be forded before the autumn. Therefore, that this might not happen, having pitched his camp in a woody place opposite to one of those bridges which Vercingetorix had taken care should be broken down, the next day he stopped behind with 2 legions, in a secret place. He sent on the rest of the forces as usual, with all the baggage, after having selected some cohorts, that the number of the legions might appear to be complete. Having ordered these to advance as far as they could, when now, from the time of day, he conjectured they had come to an encampment, he began to rebuild the bridge on the same piles, the lower part of which remained entire. Having quickly finished the work and led his legions across, he selected a fit place for a camp, and recalled the rest of his troops. Vercingetorix, on ascertaining this fact, went before him by forced marches, in order that he might not be compelled to come to an action against his will. Chapter 36. Kaiser, in 5 days' march, went from that place to Gergovia, and after engaging in a slight cavalry skirmish that day, on viewing the situation of the city, which, being built on a very high mountain, was very difficult of access, he despaired of taking it by storm, and determined to take no measures with regard to besieging it before he should secure a supply of provisions. But Vercingetorix, having pitched his camp on the mountain near the town, placed the forces of each state separately and at small intervals around himself, and, having occupied all the hills of that range as far as they commanded a view of the Roman encampment, he presented a formidable appearance. He ordered the rulers of the states, whom he had selected as his council of war, to come to him daily at the dawn, whether any measures seemed to require deliberation or execution. Nor did he allow almost any day to pass without testing in a cavalry action, the archers being intermixed, what spirit and valor there was in each of his own men. There was a hill opposite the town, at the very foot of that mountain, strongly fortified and precipitous on every side, which, if our men could gain, they seemed likely to exclude the enemy from a great share of their supply of water, and from free foraging. But this place was occupied by them with a weak garrison. However, Kaiser set out from the camp in the silence of night, and dislodging the garrison before succor could come from the town, he got possession of the place and posted 2 legions there, and drew from the greater camp to the less a double trench 12 feet broad, so that the soldiers could even singly pass secure from any sudden attack of the enemy. Chapter 37. Whilst these affairs were going on at Gergovia, Convictolitanis, the Aeduan, to whom we have observed the magistracy was adjudged by Kaiser, being bribed by the Arverni, holds a conference with certain young men, the chief of whom were Litavicus and his brothers, who were born of a most noble family. He shares the bribe with them and exhorts them to remember that they were free and born for empire, that the state of the Aedui was the only one which retarded the most certain victory of the Gauls, that the rest were held in check by its authority, and, if it was brought over, the Romans would not have room to stand on in Gaul, that he had received some kindness from Kaiser, only so far, however, as gaining a most just cause by his decision, but that he assigned more weight to the general freedom. For, why should the Aedui go to Kaiser to decide concerning their rights and laws, rather than the Romans come to the Aedui? The young men being easily won over by the speech of the magistrate and the bribe, when they declared that they would even be leaders in the plot, a plan for accomplishing it was considered, because they were confident their state could not be induced to undertake the war in slight grounds. It was resolved that Litavicus should have the command of the 10,000 which were being sent to Kaiser for the war, and should have charge of them on their march, and that his brothers should go before him to Kaiser. They arranged the other measures and the manner in which they should have them done. Chapter 38. Litavicus, having received the command of the army, suddenly convened the soldiers, when he was about 30 miles distant from Gergovia, and, weeping, said, "Soldiers, whither are we going? All our knights and all our nobles have perished. Epiretorix and Viridomarus, the principal men of the state, being accused of treason, have been slain by the Romans without even permission to plead their cause. Learn this intelligence from those who have escaped from the massacre. For I, since my brothers and all my relations have been slain, am prevented by grief from declaring what has taken place." Persons are brought forward whom he had instructed in what he would have them say, and make the same statements to the soldiery as Litavicus had made, that all the knights of the Aedui were slain because they were said to have held conferences with the Arverni, that they had concealed themselves among the multitude of soldiers, and had escaped from the midst of the slaughter. The Aedui shout aloud and conjure Litavicus to provide for their safety, as if, said he, it were a matter of deliberation, and not of necessity, for us to go to Gergovia and unite ourselves to the Arverni. Or have we any reasons to doubt that the Romans, after perpetrating the atrocious crime, are now hastening to slay us? Therefore, if there be any spirit in us, let us avenge the death of those who have perished in a most unworthy manner, and let us slay these robbers. He points to the Roman citizens who had accompanied them in reliance on his protection. He immediately seizes a great quantity of corn and provisions, cruelly tortures them, and then puts them to death, sends messengers throughout the entire state of the Aedui, and rouses them completely by the same falsehood concerning the slaughter of their knights and nobles. He earnestly advises them to avenge, in the same manner as he did, the wrongs which they had received. Chapter 39. Epiretorix the Aeduan, a young man born in the highest rank and possessing very great influence at home, and, along with Viridomarus, of equal age and influence but of inferior birth, whom Kaiser had raised from a humble position to the highest rank, on being recommended to him by Divitiacus, had come in number of horse, being summoned by Kaiser by name. These had a dispute with each other for precedence, and in the struggle between the magistrates they had contended with their utmost efforts, the one for Convictolitanus, the other for Cotus. Of these, Vercingetorix, on learning the divine of Divitiacus, lays the matter before Kaiser, almost at midnight. He entreats that Kaiser should not suffer their state to swerve from the alliance with the Roman people, owing to the depraved counsels of a few young men, which he foresaw would be the consequence if so many thousand men should unite themselves to the enemy, as their relations could not neglect their safety, nor the state regard it as a matter of slight importance. Chapter 40. Kaiser felt great anxiety on this intelligence, because he had always especially indulged the state of the Ideus, and, without any hesitation, draws out from the camp 4 light-armed legions and all the cavalry. Nor had he time at such a crisis to contract the camp, because the affair seemed to depend upon dispatch. He leaves Caius Fabius, his lieutenant, with 2 legions to guard the camp. When he orders the brothers of Litivicus to be arrested, he discovers that they had fled a short time before to the camp of the enemy. He encouraged his soldiers not to be disheartened by the labor of the journey on such a necessary occasion, and, after advancing 25 miles, all being most eager, he came in sight of the army of the Ideus, and, by sending on his cavalry, retards and impedes their march. He then issues strict orders to all his soldiers to kill no one. He commands Vercingetorix and Riedomarus, who they thought were killed, to move among the cavalry and address their friends. When they were recognized and the treachery of Litivicus discovered, the Ideus began to extend their hands to intimate submission, and, laying down their arms, to deprecate death. Litivicus, with his clansmen, who after the custom of the Gauls consider it a crime to desert their patrons, even in extreme misfortune, flees forth to Gergovia. Chapter 41. Kaiser, after sending messengers to the state of the Ideus, to inform them that they whom he could have put to death by the right of war were spared through his kindness, and after giving 3 hours of the night to his army for his repose, directed his march to Gergovia. Almost in the middle of the journey, a party of horse that were sent by Fabius stated in how great danger matters were. They inform him that the camp was attacked by a very powerful army, while fresh men were frequently relieving the wearied, and exhausting our soldiers by the incessant toil, since, on account of the size of the camp, they had constantly to remain on the rampart. That many had been wounded by the immense number of arrows and all kinds of missiles. That the engines were of great service in withstanding them. That Fabius, at their departure, leaving only 2 gates open, was blocking up the rest, and adding breastworks to the ramparts, and was preparing himself for a similar casualty on the following day. Kaiser, after receiving this information, reached the camp before sunrise owing to the very great zeal of his soldiers. Chapter 42. Whilst these things are going on at Gergovia, the Ideus, on receiving the first announcements from Litivicus, leave themselves no time to ascertain the truth of these statements. Some are stimulated by avarice, others by revenge and credulity, which is an innate propensity in that race of men to such a degree that they consider a slight rumor as an ascertained fact. They plunder the property of the Roman citizens, and either massacre them or drag them away to slavery. Convictolitanus increases the evil state of affairs and goads on the people to fury, that by the commission of some outrage they may be ashamed to return to propriety. They entice from the town of Cabellonus, by a promise of safety, Marcus Aristeus, a military tribune, who was on his march to his legion. They compel those who had settled there for the purpose of trading to do the same. By constantly attacking them on their march, they strip them of all their baggage. They besiege day and night those that resisted. When many were slain on both sides, they excite a great number to arms. Chapter 43. In the meantime, when intelligence was brought that all their soldiers were in Kaiser's power, they run in a body to Aristeus. They assure him that nothing had been done by public authority. They order an inquiry to be made about the plundered property, They confiscate the property of Bituriges and his brothers. They send ambassadors to Kaiser for the purpose of clearing themselves. They do all this with a view to recover their soldiers, but being contaminated by guilt and charmed by the gains arising from the plundered property, as that act was shared in by many, and being tempted by the fear of punishment, they began to form plans of war and stir up the other states by embassies. Although Kaiser was aware of this proceeding, yet he addresses the ambassadors with as much mildness as he can, that he did not think worse of the state on account of the ignorance and fickleness of the mob, nor would diminish his regard for the Ideus. He himself, fearing a greater commotion in Gaul, in order to prevent his being surrounded by all the states, began to form plans as to the manner in which he should return from Gergovia and again concentrate his forces, lest a departure arising from the fear of a revolt should seem like a flight. Chapter 44. Whilst he was considering these things, an opportunity of acting successfully seemed to offer. For, when he had come into the smaller camp for the purpose of securing the works, he noticed that the hill in the possession of the enemy was stripped of men, although on the former days it could scarcely be seen on the account of the numbers on it. Being astonished, he inquires the reason of it from the deserters, a great number of whom flocked to him daily. They all concurred in asserting what Kaiser himself had already ascertained by his scouts, that the back of that hill was almost level, but likewise woody and narrow, by which there was a pass to the other side of the town. That they had serious apprehensions for this place, and had no other idea, on the occupation of one hill by the Romans, than that if they should lose the other, they would be almost surrounded, and cut off from all egress and foraging. That they were all summoned by Vercingetorix to fortify this place. Chapter 45. Kaiser, on being informed of this circumstance, sends several troops of horse to the place immediately after midnight. He orders them to range in every quarter with more tumult than usual. At dawn he orders a large quantity of baggage to be drawn out of the camp, and the muleteers with helmets and the appearance and guise of horsemen to ride round the hills. To these he adds a few cavalry, with instructions to range more widely to make a show. He orders them all to seek the same quarter by a long circuit. These proceedings were seen at a distance from the town, as Gergovia commanded a view of the camp. Nor could the Gauls ascertain at so great a distance what certainty there was in the maneuver. He sends one legion to the same hill, and after it had marched a little, stations it in the lower ground, and conceals it in the woods. The suspicions of the Gauls are increased, and all their forces are marched to that place to defend it. Kaiser, having perceived the camp of the enemy deserted, covers the military insignia of his men, conceals the standards, and transfers his soldiers in small bodies from the greater to the less camp, and points out to the lieutenants whom he had placed in command over the respective legions what he should wish to be done. He particularly advises them to restrain their men from advancing too far, through their desire of fighting, or their hope of plunder. He sets before them what disadvantages the unfavorable nature of the ground carries with it, and that they could be assisted by dispatch alone. That success depended on a surprise, and not on a battle. After stating these particulars, he gives the signal for action, and detaches the Ideus at the same time by another ascent on the right. Chapter 46. The town wall was 1,200 paces distant from the plain and foot of the ascent, in a straight line, if no gap intervened. Whatever circuit was added to this ascent to make the hill easy, increased the length of the route. But almost in the middle of the hill, the Gauls had previously built a wall 6 feet high, made of large stones, and extending in length as far as the nature of the ground permitted, as a barrier to retard the advance of our men. And, leaving all the lower space empty, they had filled the upper part of the hill, as far as the wall of the town, with their camps very close to one another. The soldiers, on the signal being given, quickly advanced to this fortification, and, passing over it, make themselves masters of the separate camps. And so great was their activity in taking the camps that Tutomarus, the king of the Bituriges, being suddenly surprised in his tent, as he had gone to rest at noon, with difficulty escaped from the hands of the plunderers, with the upper part of his person naked, and his horse wounded. Chapter 47. Kaiser, having accomplished the object which he had in view, ordered the signal to be sounded for a retreat, and the soldiers of the 10th Legion, by which he was then accompanied, halted. But the soldiers of the other legions, not hearing the sound of the trumpet, because there was a very large valley between them, were however kept back by the tribunes of the soldiers and the lieutenants, according to Kaiser's orders. But, being animated by the prospect of a speedy victory and the flight of the enemy, and the favorable battles of the former periods, they thought nothing so difficult that their bravery could not accomplish it. Nor did they put an end to the pursuit until they drew nigh to the wall of the town and the gates. But then, when a shout arose in every quarter of the city, those who were at a distance, being alarmed by the sudden tumult, fled hastily from the town, since they thought that the enemy were within the gates. The matrons began to cast their clothes in silver over the wall, and bending over as far as the lower part of the bosom with outstretched hands, beseech the Romans to spare them, and not to sacrifice to their resentment even women and children, as they had done at Avaricum. Some of them let themselves down from the walls by their hands, and surrendered to our soldiers. Lucius Fabius, a centurion of the 8th Legion, who, it was ascertained, had said that day among his fellow soldiers that he was excited by the plunder of Avaricum, and would not allow anyone to mount the wall before him, finding 3 men of his own company, and being raised up by them, scaled the wall. He himself, in turn, taking hold of them one by one, drew them up to the wall. Chapter 48. In the meantime, those who had gone to the other part of the town to defend it, as we have mentioned above, at first, aroused by hearing the shouts, and afterwards by frequent accounts that the town was in possession of the Romans, sent forward their cavalry, and hastened in larger numbers to that quarter. As each first came, he stood beneath the wall, and increased the number of his countrymen engaged in action. When a great multitude of them had assembled, the matrons, who a little before were stretching their hands from the walls to the Romans, began to beseech their countrymen, and, after the Gallic fashion, to show their dishevelled hair, and bring their children into public view. Neither in position nor in numbers was the contest an equal one to the Romans. At the same time, being exhausted by running in the long continuation of the fight, they could not easily withstand fresh and vigorous troops. Chapter 49. Kaiser, when he perceived that his soldiers were fighting on unfavorable ground, and that the enemy's forces were increasing, being alarmed for the safety of his troops, sent orders to Titus Sextius, one of his lieutenants, whom he had left to guard the smaller camp, to lead out his cohorts quickly from the camp and post them at the foot of the hill on the right wing of the enemy, that if he should see our men driven from the ground, he should deter the enemy from following too closely. He himself, advancing with the legion a little from that place where he had taken his post, awaited the issue of the battle. Chapter 50. While the fight was going on most vigorously, hand to hand, and the enemy depended on their position and numbers, our men on their bravery, the Ideus suddenly appeared on our exposed flank, as Kaiser had sent them by another ascent on the right, for the sake of creating a diversion. These, from the similarity of their arms, greatly terrified our men, and although they were discovered to have their right shoulders bare, which was usually the sign of those reduced to peace, yet the soldiers suspected that this very thing was done by the enemy to deceive them. At the same time, Lucius Fabius the centurion, and those who had scaled the wall with him, being surrounded and slain, were cast from the wall. Marcus Petreius, a centurion of the same legion, after attempting to hew down the gates, was overpowered by numbers, and, despairing of his safety, having already received many wounds, said to the soldiers of his own company who followed him, "Since I cannot save you as well as myself, I shall at least provide for your safety, since I, allured by the love of glory, led you into this danger. Do you save yourselves when an opportunity is given." At the same time he rushed into the midst of the enemy, and, slaying 2 of them, drove back the rest a little from the gate. When his men attempted to aid him, "In vain," he says, "you endeavor to procure my safety, since blood and strength are now failing me. Therefore leave this while you have the opportunity, and retreat to the legion." Thus he fell fighting a few moments after, and saved his men by his own death. Chapter 51. Our soldiers, being hard pressed on every side, were dislodged from their position, with the loss of 46 centurions. But the 10th Legion, which had been posted in reserve on ground a little more level, checked the Gauls in their eager pursuit. It was supported by the cohorts of the 13th Legion, which, being led from the smaller camp, had, under the command of Titus Sextius, occupied the higher ground. The legions, as soon as they reached the plain, halted and faced the enemy. Vercingetorix led back his men from the part of the hill within the fortifications. On that day, little less than 700 of the soldiers were missing. Chapter 52. On the next day, Kaiser, having called a meeting, censured the rashness and avarice of his soldiers, in that they had judged for themselves how far they ought to proceed, or what they ought to do, and could not be kept back by the tribunes of the soldiers and the lieutenants, and stated what the disadvantage of the ground could effect, what opinion he himself had entertained at Avaricum, when, having surprised the enemy without either general or cavalry, he had given up a certain victory, lest even a trifling loss should occur in the contest owing to the disadvantage of position. That as much as he admired the greatness of their courage, since neither the fortifications of the camp, nor the height of the mountain, nor the wall of the town could retard them, in the same degree he censured their licentiousness and arrogance, because they thought that they knew more than their general concerning victory, and the issue of actions, and that he required in his soldiers forbearance and self-command, not less than valor and magnanimity. Chapter 53. Having held this assembly, and having encouraged the soldiers at the conclusion of his speech, that they should not be dispirited on this account, nor attribute to the valor of the enemy what the disadvantage of position had caused, entertaining the same views of his departure that he had previously had, he led forth the legions from the camp, and drew up his army in order of battle in a suitable place. When Vercingetorix, nevertheless, would not descend to the level ground, a slight cavalry action, and that a successful one, having taken place, he led back his army into the camp. When he had done this, the next day, thinking that he had done enough to lower the pride of the Gauls, and to encourage the mind of his soldiers, he moved his camp in the direction of the Ideus. The enemy not even then pursuing us, on the third day he repaired the bridge over the river Allier, and led over his whole army. Chapter 54. Having then held an interview with Virgomarus and Eparedorix the Iduans, he learns that Bituriges had set out with all the cavalry to raise the Ideus, that it was necessary that they too should go before him to confirm the state in their allegiance. Although he now saw distinctly the treachery of the Ideus in many things, and was of opinion that the revolt of the entire state would be hastened by their departure, yet he thought that they should not be detained, lest he should appear either to offer an insult, or betray some suspicion of fear. He briefly states to them when departing his services towards the Ideus, in what a state and how humbled he had found them, driven into their towns, deprived of their lands, stripped of all their forces, a tribute imposed on them, and hostages wrested from them with the utmost insult, and to what condition, and to what greatness, he had raised them, so much so that they had not only recovered their former position, but seemed to surpass the dignity and influence of all the previous eras of their history. After giving these admonitions, he dismissed them. Chapter 55. Noviodunum was a town of the Ideus, advantageously situated on the banks of the Loire. Kaiser had conveyed hither all the hostages of Gaul, the corn, public money, a great part of his own baggage, and that of his army. He had sent hither a great number of horses, which he had purchased in Italy and Spain on account of this war. When Eparedorix and Virgomarus came to this place, and received information of the disposition of the state, that Bituriges had been admitted by the Ideus into Bibracte, which is a town of the greatest importance among them, that Convictolitanis, the chief magistrate, and a large part of the Senate had gone to meet him, that ambassadors had been publicly sent to Vercingetorix to negotiate a peace and alliance. They thought that so great an opportunity ought not to be neglected. Therefore, having put to the sword the garrison of Noviodunum and those who had assembled there for the purpose of trading or were on their march, they divided the money and horses among themselves. They took care that the hostages of the different states should be brought to Bibracte, to the chief magistrate. They burnt the town to prevent its being of any service to the Romans. as they were of the opinion that they could not hold it. They carried away in their vessels whatever corn they could in the hurry. They destroyed the remainder by throwing it into the river or setting it on fire. They themselves began to collect forces from the neighboring country, to place guards and garrisons in different positions along the banks of the Loire, and to display the cavalry on all sides to strike terror into the Romans, to try if they could cut them off from a supply of provisions. In which expectation they were much aided, from the circumstance that the Loire had swollen to such a degree from the melting of the snows that it did not seem capable of being forded at all. Chapter 56. Kaiser, on being informed of these movements, was of opinion that he ought to make haste, even if he should run some risk in completing the bridges, in order that he might engage before greater forces of the enemy should be collected in that place. For no one even then considered it an absolutely necessary act, that changing his design he should direct his march into the province, both because the infamy and disgrace of the thing, and the intervening Mount Cevennes, and the difficulty of the roads prevented him, and especially because he had serious apprehensions for the safety of Labienus, whom he had detached, and those legions whom he had sent with him. Therefore, having made very long marches by day and night, he came to the river Loire, contrary to the expectation of all. And, having by means of the cavalry found out a ford suitable enough considering the emergency, of such depth that their arms and shoulders could be above water for supporting their accoutrements, he dispersed his cavalry in such a manner as to break the force of the current, and, having confounded the enemy at the first sight, led his army across the river in safety, and finding corn and cattle in the fields, after refreshing his army with them, he determined to march into the country of the Senones. Chapter 57. Whilst these things are being done by Kaiser, Labienus, leaving at Agendicum the recruits who had lately arrived from Italy, to guard the baggage, marches with 4 legions to Lutetia, which is a town of the Parisii, situated on an island of the river Seine, whose arrival being discovered by the enemy, numerous forces arrived from the neighboring states. The supreme command is entrusted to Camilogenus, one of the Aulerci, who, although almost worn out with age, was called to that honor on account of his extraordinary knowledge of military tactics. He, when he observed that there was a large marsh which communicated with the Seine, and rendered all that country impassable, encamped there, and determined to prevent our troops from passing it. Chapter 58. Labienus at first attempted to raise Vinii, fill up the marsh with hurdles and clay, and secure a road. After he perceived that this was too difficult to accomplish, he issued in silence from his camp at the 3rd watch, and reached Melodonum by the same route by which he came. This is a town of the Senones, situated on an island in the Seine, as we have just before observed of Lutetia. Having seized upon about 50 ships and quickly joined them together, and having placed soldiers in them, he intimidated by his unexpected arrival the inhabitants, of whom a great number had been called out to the war, and obtains possession of the town without a contest. Having repaired the bridge, which the enemy had broken down during the preceding days, he led over his army and began to march along the banks of the river to Lutetia. The enemy, on learning the circumstance from those who had escaped from Melodonum, set fire to Lutetia, and ordered the bridges of that town to be broken down. They themselves set out from the marsh and take their position on the banks of the Seine, over against Lutetia and opposite the camp of Labienus. Chapter 59. Kaiser was now reported to have departed from Gergovia. Intelligence was likewise brought to them concerning the revolt of the Idui and a successful rising in Gaul, and that Kaiser, having been prevented from prosecuting his journey and crossing the Loire, and having been compelled by the want of corn, had marched hastily to the province. But the Bellovaci, who had been previously disaffected of themselves, on learning the revolt of the Idui, began to assemble forces and openly prepare for war. Then Labienus, as the change in affairs was so great, thought that he must adopt a very different system from what he had previously intended, and he did not now think of making any new acquisitions, or of provoking the enemy to an action, but that he might bring back his army safe to Agendicum. For, on one side, the Bellovaci, a state which held the highest reputation for prowess in Gaul, were pressing on him, and Camulogenus, with a disciplined and well-equipped army, held the other side. Moreover, a very great river separated and cut off the legions from the garrison and baggage. He saw that, in consequence of such great difficulties being thrown in his way, he must seek aid from his own energy of disposition. Chapter 60. Having therefore called a council of war a little before evening, he exhorted his soldiers to execute with diligence and energy such commands as he should give. He assigns the ships which he had brought from Melodonum to Roman knights, one to each, and orders them to fall down the river silently for 4 miles, at the end of the 4th watch, and there wait for him. He leaves the 5 cohorts, which he considered to be the most steady in action, to guard the camp. He orders the 5 remaining cohorts of the same legion to proceed a little after midnight up the river with all their baggage, in a great tumult. He collects also some small boats, and sends them in the same direction, with orders to make a loud noise in rowing. He himself, a little after, marched out in silence, and at the head of 3 legions, seeks that place to which he had ordered the ships to be brought. Chapter 61. When he had arrived there, the enemy's scouts, as they were stationed along every part of the river, not expecting an attack, because a great storm had suddenly arisen, were surprised by our soldiers. The infantry and cavalry are quickly transported under the superintendence of the Roman knights, whom he had appointed to that office. Almost at the same time, a little before daylight, intelligence was given to the enemy that there was an unusual tumult in the camp of the Romans, and that a strong force was marching up the river, and that the sound of oars was distinctly heard in the same quarter, and that soldiers were being conveyed across in ships a little below. On hearing these things, because they were of opinion that the legions were passing in 3 different places, and that the entire army, being terrified by the revolt of the Idui, were preparing for flight, they divided their forces also into 3 divisions. 4 leaving a small guard opposite to the camp, and sending a small body in the direction of Matteosedum, with orders to advance as far as the ships would proceed, they led the rest of their troops against Labienus. Chapter 62. By daybreak all our soldiers were brought across, and the army of the enemy was in sight. Labienus, having encouraged his soldiers to retain the memory of their ancient valor and so many most successful actions, and imagine Kaiser himself, under whose command they had so often routed the enemy, to be present, gives the signal for action. At the first onset, the enemy are beaten and put to flight on the right wing, where the 7th Legion stood. On the left wing, which position the 12th Legion held, although the first ranks fell transfixed by the javelins of the Romans, yet the rest resisted most bravely, nor did any one of them show the slightest intention of flying. Camulogenus, the general of the enemy, was present and encouraged his troops. But when the issue of the victory was still uncertain, and the circumstances which were taking place on the left wing were announced to the tribunes of the 7th Legion, they faced about their legion to the enemy's rear, and attacked it. Not even then did any one retreat, but all were surrounded and slain. Camulogenus met the same fate. But those who were left as a guard opposite the camp of Labienus, when they heard that the battle was commenced, marched to aid their countrymen and take possession of a hill, but were unable to withstand the attack of the victorious soldiers. In this manner, mixed with their own fugitives, such as the woods and mountains did not shelter, were cut to pieces by our cavalry. When this battle was finished, Labienus returns to Agendicum, where the baggage of the whole army had been left. From it, he marched with all his forces to Kaiser. Chapter 63. The revolt of the Idui being known, the war grows more dangerous. Embassies are sent by them in all directions. As far as they can prevail by influence, authority, or money, they strive to excite the state to revolt. Having got possession of the hostages whom Kaiser had deposited with them, they terrify the hesitating by putting them to death. The Idui request Vercingetorix to come to them and communicate his plans of conducting the war. On obtaining this request, they insist that the chief command should be assigned to them, and when the affair becomes a disputed question, a council of all Gaul is summoned to Bibracte. They come together in great numbers and from every quarter to the same place. The decision is left to the votes of the mass. All to a man approve of Vercingetorix as their general. The Remi, Lingones, and Treviri were absent from this meeting. The 2 former because they attached themselves to the alliance of Rome. the Treviri because they were very remote and were hard-pressed by the Germans, which was also the reason of their being absent during the whole war, and their sending auxiliaries to neither party. The Idui are highly indignant at being deprived of the chief command. They lament the change of fortune and miss Kaiser's indulgence towards them. However, after engaging in the war, they do not dare to pursue their own measures apart from the rest. Epiretorix and Viridomarus, youths of the greatest promise, submit reluctantly to Vercingetorix. Chapter 64. The latter demands hostages from the remaining states, nay, more, appointed a day for this proceeding. He orders all the cavalry, 15,000 in number, to quickly assemble here. He says that he will be content with the infantry which he had before, and would not tempt fortune nor come to a regular engagement. But, since he had an abundance of cavalry, it would be very easy for him to prevent the Romans from obtaining forage or corn, provided that they themselves should resolutely destroy their corn and set fire to their houses, by which sacrifice of private property they would evidently obtain perpetual dominion and freedom. After arranging these matters, he levies 10,000 infantry on the Idui and Segusiani, who border on our province. To these he adds 800 horse. He sets over them the brother of Epiretorix, and orders him to wage war against the Allobroges. On the other side he sends the Gabali and the nearest cantons of the Arverni against the Helvii. He likewise sends the Ruteni and Cadurci to lay waste the territories of the Volcae Arachamici. Besides, by secret messages and embassies, he tampers with the Allobroges, whose minds, he hopes, had not yet settled down, after the excitement of the late war. To their nobles he promises money, and to their state the dominion of the whole province. Chapter 65. The only guards provided against all these contingencies were 22 cohorts, which were collected from the entire province by Lucius Kaiser, the lieutenant, and opposed to the enemy in every quarter. The Helvii, voluntarily engaging in battle with their neighbors, are defeated, and Caius Valerius Donotaurus, the son of Caburus, the principal man of the state, and several others, being slain, they are forced to retire within their towns and fortifications. The Allobroges, placing guards along the course of the Rhine, defend their frontiers with great vigilance and energy. Kaiser, as he perceived that the enemy were superior in cavalry, and he himself could receive no aid from the province or Italy, while all communication was cut off, sends across the Rhine into Germany to those states which he had subdued in the preceding campaigns, and summons from them cavalry and the light-armed infantry, who were accustomed to engage among them. On their arrival, as they were mounted on unserviceable horses, he takes horses from the military tribunes and the rest, nay, even from the Roman knights and veterans, and distributes them among the Germans. Chapter 66. In the meantime, whilst these things are going on, the forces of the enemy from the Arverni, and the cavalry which had been demanded from all Gaul, meet together. A great number of these having been collected, when Kaiser was marching into the country of the Sequani, through the confines of the Lingones, in order that he might the more easily render aid to the province, Vercingetorix encamped in 3 days, about 10 miles from the Romans, and, having summoned the commanders of the cavalry to a council, he shows that the time of victory was come, that the Romans were fleeing into the province and leaving Gaul, that this was sufficient for obtaining immediate freedom, but was of little moment in acquiring peace and tranquility for the future, for the Romans would return after assembling greater forces, and would not put an end to the war. Therefore, they should attack them on their march when encumbered. If the infantry should be obliged to relieve their cavalry and be retarded by doing so, the march could not be accomplished. If, abandoning their baggage, they should provide for their safety, a result which he trusted was more likely to ensue, they would lose both property and character. For as to the enemy's horse, they ought not to entertain a doubt that none of them would dare to advance beyond the main body. In order that they, the Gauls, may do so with greater spirit, he would marshal all their forces before the camp, and intimidate the enemy. The cavalry unanimously shout out that they ought to bind themselves by a most sacred oath, that he should not be received under a roof, nor have access to his children, parents, or wife, who shall not twice have ridden through the enemy's army. Chapter 67. This proposal receiving general approbation, and all being forced to take the oath, on the next day the cavalry were divided into 3 parts, and 2 of these divisions made a demonstration on our 2 flanks, while one in front began to obstruct our march. On this circumstance being announced, Kaiser orders his cavalry also to form 3 divisions and charge the enemy. Then the action commences simultaneously in every part. The main body halts, the baggage is received within the ranks of the legions. If our men seemed to be distressed or hard-pressed in any quarter, Kaiser usually ordered the troops to advance, and the army to wheel round in that quarter, which conduct retarded the enemy in the pursuit and encouraged our men by the hope of support. At length the Germans on the right wing, having gained the top of the hill, dislodge the enemy from their position, and pursue them even as far as the river at which Vercingetorix with the infantry was stationed, and slay several of them. The rest, on observing this action, fearing lest they should be surrounded, betake themselves to flight. A slaughter ensues in every direction, and 3 of the noblest of the Ideus are taken and brought to Kaiser. Cotus, the commander of the cavalry, who had been engaged in the contest with Convictolitanus the last election, Caurelus, who had held the command of the infantry after the revolt of Bituriges, and Eporedorix, under whose command the Igui had engaged in war against the Sequani before the arrival of Kaiser. Chapter 68. All his cavalry being routed, Vercingetorix led back his troops in the same order as he had arranged them before the camp, and immediately began to march to Alesia, which is a town of the Mandubii, and ordered the baggage to be speedily brought forth from the camp, and follow him closely. Kaiser, having conveyed his baggage to the nearest hill, and having left 2 legions to guard it, pursued as far as the time of day would permit, and after slaying about 3,000 of the rear of the enemy, encamped at Alesia on the next day. On reconnoitering the situation of the city, finding that the enemy were panic-stricken because the cavalry in which they placed their chief reliance were beaten, he encouraged his men to endure the toil, and began to draw a line of circumvallation round Alesia. Chapter 69. The town itself was situated on the top of a hill, in a very lofty position, so that it did not appear likely to be taken except by a regular siege. 2 rivers, on 2 different sides, washed the foot of the hill. Before the town lay a plain of about 3 miles in length. On every other side, hills at a moderate distance, and of an equal degree of height, surrounded the town. The army of the Gauls had filled all the space under the wall, comprising the part of the hill which looked to the rising sun, and had drawn in front a trench and a stone wall 6 feet high. The circuit of that fortification, which was commenced by the Romans, comprised 11 miles. The camp was pitched in a strong position, and 23 redoubts were raised in it, in which sentinels were placed by day, lest any sally should be made suddenly, and by night the same were occupied by watches and strong guards. Chapter 70. The work having been begun, a cavalry action ensues in that plain, which we have already described as broken by hills, and extending 3 miles in length. The contest is maintained on both sides with the utmost vigor. Kaiser sends the Germans to aid our troops when distressed, and draws up the legions in front of the camp, lest any sally should be suddenly made by the enemy's infantry. The courage of our men is increased by the additional support of the legions. The enemy being put to flight, hinder one another by their numbers, and as only the narrower gates were left open, are crowded together in them. Then the Germans pursue them with vigor even to the fortifications. A great slaughter ensues. Some leave their horses and endeavor to cross the ditch and climb the wall. Kaiser orders the legions which he had drawn up in front of the rampart to advance a little. The Gauls, who were within the fortifications, were no less panic-stricken, thinking that the enemy were coming that moment against them, and unanimously shout, "To arms!" Some, in their alarm, rush into the town. Vercingetorix orders the gates to be shut, lest the camp should be left undefended. The Germans retreat, after slaying many and taking several horses. Chapter 71. Vercingetorix adopts the design of sending away all his cavalry by night, before the fortifications should be completed by the Romans. He charges them when departing that each of them should go to his respective state and press for the war all who were old enough to bear arms. He states his own merits, and conjures them to consider his safety, and not surrender him, who had deserved so well of the general freedom, to the enemy for torture. He points out to them that if they should be remiss, 80,000 chosen men would perish with him. That upon making a calculation, he had barely corn for 30 days, but could hold out a little longer by economy. After giving these instructions, he silently dismisses the cavalry in the second watch, on that side where our works were not completed. He orders all the corn to be brought to himself. He ordains capital punishment to such as would not obey. He distributes among them, man by man, the cattle, great quantities of which had been driven there by the Mandubii. He began to measure out the corn sparingly, and little by little. He receives into the town all the forces which he had posted in front of it. In this manner he prepares to await the succors from Gaul, and carry on the war. Chapter 72. Kaiser, on learning these proceedings from the deserters and captives, adopted the following system of fortification. He dug a trench 20 feet deep, with perpendicular sides, in such a manner that the base of this trench should extend so far as the edges were apart from the top. He raised all his other works at a distance of 400 feet from that ditch. He did that with this intention, lest, since he necessarily embraced so extensive an area, and the whole works could not be easily surrounded by a line of soldiers, a large number of the enemy should suddenly, or by night, sally against the fortifications, or lest they should by day cast weapons against our men while occupied with the works. Having left this interval, he drew 2 trenches 15 feet broad, and of the same depth. The innermost of them, being in low and level ground, he filled with water conveyed from the river. Behind these he raised a rampart and wall 12 feet high. To this he adds a parapet and battlements, with large stakes cut like stag's horns, projecting from the junction of the parapet and battlements, to prevent the enemy from scaling it, and surrounded the entire work with turrets, which were 80 feet distant from one another. Chapter 73. It was necessary at one and the same time to procure timber for the rampart, lay in supplies of corn, and raise also extensive fortifications, and the available troops were in consequence of this reduced in number, since they used to advance to some distance from the camp, and sometimes the Gauls endeavored to attack our works, and to make a sally from the town by several gates, and in great force. On which Kaiser thought that further additions should be made to these works, in order that the fortifications might be defensible by a small number of soldiers. Having therefore cut down the trunks of trees or very thick branches, and having stripped their tops of the bark and sharpened them to a point, he drew a continued trench everywhere 5 feet deep. These stakes being sunk into this trench and fastened firmly at the bottom to prevent the possibility of their being torn up, had their branches only projecting from the ground. There were 5 rows in connection with and intersecting each other, and whoever entered within them were likely to impale themselves on these very sharp stakes. The soldiers called these cipi. Before these, which were arranged in oblique rows in the form of a quincunx, pits 3 feet deep were dug, which gradually diminished in depth to the bottom. In these pits tapering stakes, of the thickness of a man's thigh, sharpened at the top and hardened in the fire, were sunk in such a manner as to project from the ground not more than 4 inches. At the same time, for the purpose of giving them strength and stability, they were each filled with trampled clay to the height of 1 foot from the bottom. The rest of the pit was covered over with osiers and twigs to conceal the deceit. 8 rows of this kind were dug, and were 3 feet distant from each other. They called this a lily from its resemblance to that flower. Stakes 1 foot long, with iron hooks attached to them, were entirely sunk in the ground before these, and were planted in every place at small intervals. These they called spurs. Chapter 74. After completing these works, having selected as level ground as he could, considering the nature of the country, and having enclosed an area of 14 miles, he constructed, against an external enemy, fortifications of the same kind in every respect, and separate from these, so that the guards of the fortifications could not be surrounded, even by immense numbers, if such a circumstance should take place owing to the departure of the enemy's cavalry. And in order that the Roman soldiers might not be compelled to go out of the camp with great risk, he orders all to provide forage and corn for 30 days. Chapter 75. Whilst those things are carried on at Alesia, the Gauls, having convened a council of their chief nobility, determined that all who could bear arms should not be called out, which was the opinion of Vercingetorix, but that a fixed number should be levied from each state, lest when so great a multitude assembled together, they could neither govern nor distinguish their men, nor have the means of supplying them with corn. They demand 35,000 men from the Idui, and their dependents, the Segusiani, Ambivereti, and Aulerci Branovices, an equal number from the Arverni, in conjunction with the Alueti Caderci, Gabali, and Velauni, who were accustomed to be under the command of the Arverni. 12,000 each from the Senones, Sequani, Bituriges, Centones, Ruteni, and Carnutes. 10,000 from the Belovaci, the same number from the Lemoici. 8,000 each from the Pictones, Anturoni, and Parisi, and Helvi. 5,000 each from the Suessones, Ambiani, Mediomatrici, Petrocori, Nervi, Morini, and Nitiobriges. The same number from the Aulerci Canomani. 4,000 from the Atrebatis. 3,000 each from the Belocassi, Lexovi, and Aulerci Ebirovices. 30,000 from the Rauraki and Boii. 6,000 from all the states together which border on the Atlantic, and which in their dialect are called Armoricae, in which number are comprehended the Curisolites, Redones, Ambibari, Caltes, Osismii, Lemuices, Veneti, and Unelli. Of these, the Belovaci did not contribute their number, as they said that they would wage war against the Romans on their own account, and at their own discretion, and would not obey the order of anyone. However, at the request of Commius, they sent 2,000, in consideration of a tie of hospitality which subsisted between him and them. Chapter 76. Kaiser had, as we have previously narrated, availed himself of the faithful and valuable services of this Commius in Britain in former years, in consideration of which merits he had exempted from taxes his, Commius's, state, and had conferred on Commius himself the country of the Morini. Yet such was the unanimity of the Gauls in asserting their freedom and recovering their ancient renown in war, that they were influenced neither by favours nor by the recollection of private friendship, and all earnestly directed their energies and resources to that war, and collected 8,000 cavalry, and about 240,000 infantry. These were reviewed in the country of the Idui, and the calculation was made of their numbers. Commanders were appointed. The supreme command is entrusted to Commius the Atrebatian, Viridomarus and Eporedorix the Iduans, and Vergasillanus the Arvernian, and cousin German of Vercingetorix. To them are assigned men selected from each state, by whose advice the war should be conducted. All marched to Alesia, sanguine and full of confidence. Nor was there a single individual who imagined that the Romans could withstand the sight of such an immense host, especially in an action carried on both in front and rear, when on the inside the besieged would sally from the town and attack the enemy, and on the outside so great forces of cavalry and infantry would be seen. Chapter 77. But those who were blockaded at Alesia, the day being past on which they had expected auxiliaries from their countrymen, and all their corn being consumed, ignorant of what was going on among the Idui, convened an assembly and deliberated on the exigency of their situation. After various opinions had been expressed among them, some of which proposed a surrender, others a sally, whilst their strength would support it, the speech of Critognatus ought not to be omitted for its singular and detestable cruelty. He sprung from the noblest family among the Arverni, and possessing great influence, says, "I shall pay no attention to the opinion of those who call a most disgraceful surrender by the name of a capitulation, nor do I think that they ought to be considered as citizens, or summoned to the council. My business is with those who approve of a sally, in whose advice the memory of our ancient prowess seems to dwell in the opinion of you all. To be unable to bear privation for a short time is disgraceful cowardice, not true valor. Those who voluntarily offer themselves to death are more easily found than those who would calmly endure distress. And I would approve of this opinion, for honor is a powerful motive with me, could I foresee no other loss save that of life. But let us, in adopting our design, look back on all Gaul which we have stirred up to our aid. What courage do you think would our relatives and friends have if 80,000 men were butchered in one spot, supposing that they should be forced to come to an action almost over our corpses? Do not utterly deprive them of your aid, for they have spurned all thoughts of personal danger on account of your safety, nor by your folly, rashness, and cowardice crush all Gaul and doom it to an eternal slavery. Do you doubt their fidelity and firmness because they have not come at the appointed day? What then? Do you suppose that the Romans are employed every day in the outer fortifications for mere amusement? If you cannot be assured by their dispatches, since every avenue is blocked up, take the Romans as evidence that their approach is drawing near, since they, intimidated by alarm at this, labor night and day at their works. What therefore is my design? To do as our ancestors did in the war against the Cimbri and Teutones, which was by no means equally momentous, who, when driven into their towns and oppressed by similar privations, supported life by the corpses of those who appeared useless for war on account of their age, and did not surrender to the enemy. And even if we had not a precedent for such cruel conduct, still I should consider it most glorious that one should be established and delivered to posterity. For in what was that war like this? The Cimbri, after laying Gaul waste and inflicting great calamities, at length departed from our country, and sought other lands. They left us our rights, laws, lands, and liberty. But what other motive or wish have the Romans, than, induced by envy, to settle in the lands and states of those whom they have learned by fame to be noble and powerful in war, and impose on them perpetual slavery? For they never have carried on wars on any other terms. But if you know not these things which are going on in distant countries, look to the neighboring Gaul, which, being reduced to the form of a province, stripped of its rights and laws, and subjected to Roman despotism, is oppressed by perpetual slavery. Chapter 78. When different opinions were expressed, they determined that those who, owing to age or ill health, were unserviceable for war, should depart from the town, and that themselves should try every expedient before they had recourse to the advice of Critognatus. However, that they would rather adopt that design, if circumstances should compel them and their allies should delay, than accept any terms of a surrender or peace. The Mandubii, who had admitted them into the town, are compelled to go forth with their wives and children. When these came to the Roman fortifications weeping, they begged of the soldiers by every entreaty to receive them as slaves and relieve them with food. But Kaiser, placing guards on the rampart, forbade them to be admitted. Chapter 79. In the meantime, Commius and the rest of the leaders, to whom the supreme command had been entrusted, came with all their forces to Alesia, and, having occupied the entire hill, encamped not more than a mile from our fortifications. The following day, having led forth their cavalry from the camp, they fill all that plain, which we have related extended 3 miles in length, and draw out their infantry a little from that place, and post them on the higher ground. The town Alesia commanded a view of the whole plain. The besieged run together when these auxiliaries were seen. Mutual congratulations ensue, and the minds of all are elated with joy. Accordingly, drawing out their troops, they encamp before the town, and cover the nearest trench with hurdles, and fill it up with earth, and make ready for a sally and every casualty. Chapter 80. Kaiser, having stationed his army on both sides of the fortifications, in order that if occasion should arise, each should hold and know his own post, orders the cavalry to issue forth from the camp and commence action. There was a commanding view from the entire camp, which occupied a ridge of hills, and the minds of all the soldiers anxiously awaited the issue of the battle. The Gauls had scattered archers and light-armed infantry here and there among their cavalry to give relief to their retreating troops, and to sustain the impetuosity of our cavalry. Several of our soldiers were unexpectedly wounded by these and left the battle. When the Gauls were confident that their countrymen were the conquerors in the action, and beheld our men hard-pressed by numbers, both those who were hemmed in by the line of circumvallation and those who had come to aid them supported the spirits of their men by shouts and yells from every quarter. As the action was carried on in sight of all, neither a brave nor a cowardly act could be concealed. Both the desire of praise and the fear of ignominy urged on each party to valor. After fighting from noon almost to sunset, without victory inclining in favor of either, the Germans on one side made a charge against the enemy in a compact body and drove them back. And when they were put to flight, the archers were surrounded and cut to pieces. In other parts, likewise, our men pursued to the camp the retreating enemy, and did not give them an opportunity of rallying. But those who had come forth from Alesia returned into the town dejected, and almost despairing of success. Chapter 81. The Gauls, after the interval of a day, and after making during that time an immense number of hurdles, scaling ladders, and iron hooks, silently went forth from the camp at midnight and approached the fortifications in the plain. Raising a shout suddenly that by this intimation those who were besieged in the town might learn their arrival, they began to cast down hurdles and dislodge our men from the rampart by slings, arrows, and stones, and executed the other movements which are requisite in storming. At the same time, Vercingetorix, having heard the shout, gives the signal to his troops by a trumpet, and leads them forth from the town. Our troops, as each man's post had been assigned him some days before, man the fortifications. They intimidate the Gauls by slings, large stones, stakes which they had placed along the works, and bullets. All view being prevented by the darkness, many wounds are received on both sides. Several missiles are thrown from the engines. But Marcus Antonius and Caius Trebonius, the lieutenants to whom the defense of these parts had been allotted, drafted troops from the redoubts which were more remote, and sent them to aid our troops, in whatever direction they understood that they were hard-pressed. Chapter 82. Whilst the Gauls were at a distance from the fortification, they did more in execution owing to the immense number of their weapons. After they came nearer, they either unawares impaled themselves on the spurs, or were pierced by the mural darts from the ramparts and towers, and thus perished. After receiving many wounds on all sides, and having forced no part of the works, when day drew nigh, fearing lest they should be surrounded by a sally made from the higher camp on the exposed flank, they retreated to their countrymen. But those within, whilst they bring forward those things which had been prepared by Vercingetorix for a sally, fill up the nearest trenches. Having delayed a long time in executing these movements, they learned the retreat of their countrymen before they drew nigh to the fortifications. Thus they returned to the town without accomplishing their object. Chapter 83. The Gauls, having been twice repulsed with great loss, consult what they should do. They avail themselves of the information of those who were well acquainted with the country. From them they ascertained the position and fortification of the upper camp. There was on the north side a hill which our men could not include in their works on account of the extent of the circuit, and had necessarily made their camp in ground almost disadvantageous, and pretty steep. Caius Antistius Reginus and Caius Caninius Rebellus, two of the lieutenants, with 2 legions, were in possession of this camp. The leaders of the enemy, having reconnoitered the country by their scouts, select from the entire army 60,000 men, belonging to those states which bear the highest character for courage. They privately arrange among themselves what they wish to be done, and in what manner. They decide that the attack should take place when it should seem to be noon. They appoint over their forces Vercingetorix, the Arvernian, one of the 4 generals, and a near relative of Vercingetorix. He, having issued from the camp at the first watch, and having almost completed his march a little before the dawn, hid himself behind the mountain, and ordered his soldiers to refresh themselves after their labor during the night. When noon now seemed to draw nigh, he marched hastily against that camp which we have mentioned before, and at the same time the cavalry began to approach the fortifications in the plain, and the rest of the forces to make a demonstration in front of the camp. Chapter 84. Vercingetorix, having beheld his countrymen from the citadel of Alesia, issues forth from the town. He brings forth from the camp long hooks, movable penthouses, mural hooks, and other things which he had prepared for the purpose of making a sally. They engage on all sides at once, and every expedient is adopted. They flocked to whatever part of the works seemed weakest. The army of the Romans is distributed along their extensive lines, and with difficulty meets the enemy in every quarter. The shouts which were raised by the combatants in their rear had a great tendency to intimidate our men, because they perceived that their danger rested on the valor of others. For generally, all evils which are distant most powerfully alarm men's minds. Chapter 85. Kaiser, having selected a commanding situation, sees distinctly whatever is going on in every quarter, and sends assistance to his troops when hard pressed. The idea uppermost in the minds of both parties is that the present is the time in which they would have the fairest opportunity of making a struggle. The Gauls despairing of all safety, unless they should succeed in forcing the lines. The Romans expecting an end to all their labors if they should gain the day. The principal struggle is at the upper lines, to which we have said where Gallic was sent. The least elevation of ground, adding to a declivity, exercises a momentous influence. Some are casting missiles, others, forming a testudo, advance to the attack. Fresh men by turns relieve the wearied. The earth, heaped up by all against the fortifications, gives the means of ascent to the Gauls, and covers those works which the Romans have concealed in the ground. Our men have no longer arms or strength. Chapter 86. Kaiser, on observing these movements, sends Labienus with 6 cohorts to relieve his distressed soldiers. He orders him, if he should be unable to withstand them, to draw off the cohorts and make a sally, but not to do this except through necessity. He himself goes to the rest, and exhorts them not to succumb to the toil. He shows them that the fruits of all former engagements depend on that day and hour. The Gauls within, despairing of forcing the fortifications on the plain on account of the greatness of the works, attempt the places precipitous in ascent. Hither they bring the engines which they have prepared. By the immense number of their missiles they dislodge the defenders from the turrets. They fill the ditches with clay and hurdles, then clear the way. They tear down the rampart and breastwork with hooks. Chapter 87. Kaiser sends at first young Brutus with 7 cohorts, and afterwards Caius Fabius, his lieutenant, with 7 others. Finally, as they fought more obstinately, he leads up fresh men to the assistance of his soldiers. After renewing the action and repulsing the enemy, he marches in the direction in which he had sent Labienus, drafts 4 cohorts from the nearest redoubt, and orders part of the cavalry to follow him, and part to make the circuit of the external fortifications and attack the enemy in the rear. Labienus, when neither the ramparts or ditches could check the onset of the enemy, informs Kaiser by messengers of what he intended to do. Kaiser hastens to share in the action. Chapter 88. His arrival being known from the color of his robe and the troops of cavalry, and the cohorts which he had ordered to follow him being seen, as these low and sloping grounds were plainly visible from the eminences, the enemy joined battle. A shout being raised on both sides, it was succeeded by a general shout along the ramparts and whole line of fortifications. Our troops, laying aside their javelins, carry on the engagement with their swords. The cavalry is suddenly seen in the rear of the Gauls. The other cohorts advance rapidly. The enemy turn their backs. The cavalry intercept them in their flight, and a great slaughter ensues. Julius, the general and chief of the Lemoiques, is slain, where Gallic, the Arvernian, is taken alive in the flight. 74 military standards are brought to Kaiser, and few out of so great a number return safe to their camp. The besieged, beholding from the town the slaughter and flight of their countrymen, despairing of safety, lead back their troops from the fortifications. A flight of the Gauls from their camp immediately ensues on hearing of this disaster, and had not the soldiers been wearied by sending frequent reinforcements, and the labor of the entire day, all the enemy's forces could have been destroyed. Immediately after midnight, the cavalry are sent out and overtake the rear. A great number are taken or cut to pieces. The rest by flight escape in different directions to their respective states. Chapter 89, where Vercingetorix, having convened a council the following day, declares that he had undertaken that war not on account of his own exigencies, but on account of the general freedom, and since he must yield to fortune, he offered himself to them for either purpose, whether they should wish to atone to the Romans by his death, or surrender him alive. Ambassadors are sent to Kaiser on this subject. He orders their arms to be surrendered and their chieftains delivered up. He seated himself at the head of the lines in front of the camp. The Gallic chieftains are brought before him. They surrender Vercingetorix and lay down their arms. Reserving the Ideus and Arverni to try if he could gain over, through their influence, their respective states, he distributes one of the remaining captives to each soldier throughout the entire army as plunder. Chapter 90. After making these arrangements, he marches into the country of the Ideus and recovers that state. To this place ambassadors are sent by the Arverni, who promise that they will execute his commands. He demands a great number of hostages. He sends the legions to winter quarters. He restores about 20,000 captives to the Ideus and Arverni. He orders Titus Labienus to march into the country of the Sequani with 2 legions and the cavalry, and to him he attaches Marcus Sempronius Rutilius. He places Caius Fabius and Lucius Minucius Bacillus with 2 legions in the country of the Remi, lest they should sustain any loss from the Bellovaci in their neighborhood. He sends Caius Antistius Reginus into the country of the Ambivareti, Titus Sextius into the territories of the Bituriges, and Caius Caninius Rebilus into those of the Ruteni, with 1 legion each. He stations Quintus Tullius Cicero and Publius Sulpicius among the Ideus at Cabillo and Matisco on the Seine, to procure supplies of corn. He himself determines to winter at Bibracte. A supplication of 20 days is decreed by the Senate at Rome, on learning these successes from Kaiser's dispatches.